Hey, church family, welcome to our last class from the book of Colossians, and welcome to a new location in our house. I'm actually trying to record this video a little bit early, just because of how the last few days have gone. I got a window to kind of get the video taken care of, and I am trying to get it done now. So, not live, you can pretend that I'm live. By all means, feel free still to pop any questions or comments into the either Facebook, or you can always text me or email me, call me, and I'll do my best to answer those as they come up. Tonight's class is going to be just a little bit shorter, mainly because we're at the end of the book of Colossians, and there's not a whole lot at the end of the book that I think warrants talking about. He talks about a number of people, and we'll bring up a couple of those as he tries to kind of make connections with the community that's there and provide some instruction. I think overall, where I want to end tonight is just reminding you of what the book itself, what its purpose is, what its message is, and why that's important to us today. Paul writes to a church community that needs a refresher on what is central. They've got some other ideas and some other priorities that have made their way into the church community. I think Paul addresses those in some generic ways that make it difficult for us, 2,000 years removed almost, to understand exactly what he's talking about. But he talks about some struggles in the church community with unity, specifically regarding various beliefs that are taking people down wrong paths. He talks about beliefs in elemental spirits. He talks about battles over rituals and regulations connected to Judaism. He talks about wisdom and philosophy, and of course those being important tenets of Roman culture. And so you see a little bit of everything. And you've said it a number of times, but one final reminder, that shouldn't be all of that surprising in Asia Minor, where the city of Colossae is. You're talking about an area that's on the world's crossroads. Traffic going from Rome, which is to the east of where Colossae and Asia Minor are, moving to the east where, some old empires still have large populations. Talking about Babylon and Persia, places that have been connected by the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. Now there's this corridor of travel, and so with people move ideas. Colossae has a large Jewish community, but it's not by any stretch a majority. There are still large Greek populations, local indigenous populations, and these ideas kind of come together, and it was a Greek and Roman mentality to take what you consider to be the best or the most truthful or the most meaningful to you of these different ideas and kind of blend them together to create your own rule of life, your own way. And so we see that in this synchronism between these various religious beliefs. And I think some of that is what's behind the struggles that the church in Colossae is having. So Paul is reminding them that for all of the other ideas and things that are out there, as believers in Christ, there is one thing that is always central to their faith. That one thing is Christ. So if there's ever a question about what to do or how to do it, the place to look is Jesus. What would Jesus do is not a 1990s and early 2000s bracelet slogan in the Western world. It is the question that Paul encourages his audience to ask themselves. Of course, my doorbell rings in the middle of this. Oh well. As they approach life and faith in general, they need to have that question in front of them because it says everything about who they are as believers and who they are as a community. Paul closes with some words of wisdom on how they should interact with each other and with outsiders. He says, keep on praying, verse 2 of chapter 4, and guard your prayer with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray for us also. Pray that God would open a door for the words that we can preach the secret plan of Christ, which is why I am in chains. Pray that I may be able to make it as clear as I ought when I preach, act wisely towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Your speech should always be gracious and sprinkled with insight, so that you may know how to respond to every person. Paul uses an image that my translation doesn't bring out there at the end of salt, this idea of salt being such an important mineral in the ancient world for food, for life, for healing, for like all of these different things. And Paul is saying that there needs to be something palatable, something life-giving, something savory to your words and your interactions with outsiders. How you interact with people matters. And so part of that is that it is something solid. It's not ever changing. It's consistent. And that's something that they should be mindful of as they interact with people outside their church community, and certainly also as they interact with people who are inside their church community. He also tells them to pray with gratitude. And the way it's worded in Greek, it's not necessarily clear how exactly he means that. There are a few different ways, either that you should be grateful in prayer or that your own gratitude should shape how you pray. And I think Paul is pretty good at multiple meanings in single sentences. And so this is an area where he's using a phrase that encourages them to pray with gratefulness, but not just pray with gratefulness, also let it shape their lives, and that being a very important core idea of the Christian community and certainly of Jesus' life on their behalf. And then in the last handful of verses, Paul goes through instructions on here's some individuals, here's how I want you to greet them, and he talks, one of them is Onesimus. And the reason that I want to spend a moment talking about Onesimus is I think what I'm going to do next week, and maybe the week after that, it may take 2 weeks to do, is take a look at the book of Philemon, a book that we don't spend a lot of time talking about, but is deeply connected to the book of Colossians. Philemon is seems to be a wealthy individual in the city of Colossae, and I say that because he has his own household. Likely the church meets in his household. He owns at least one slave in Onesimus. He is a person of some means and an important member of the church community, as it appears from the text that we have, and more on that as we look at Philemon next week. He's got a slave named Onesimus who has run away, and at some point they cross paths with Paul, and as Paul writes this letter to the church in Colossae, Onesimus is one of the people he mentions him in high regard, that he's sending them back to him. So Onesimus is one of the ones who's now playing delivery for Paul as a message bearer on his behalf. And, you know, Onesimus is one of two people who carries this message, and that Paul doesn't give more details in his writing about his own situation. He simply says in like verse 9, talk to those guys. They'll be the ones who fill you in on exactly what is going on for me where I'm at. And so he bears some burden of responsibility for updating the church in Colossae on what's going on with Paul's ministry, with his setting in prison, of others who are with Paul, who get mentioned later on in the letter as well, though I'm not going to take the time to read through all of those names. I encourage you to take the time to do that. And so we have, without Paul having to say a whole lot of words, certainly the people in the church knowing the story one way or the other, we have this moment where whether Onesimus is carrying both the Colossian letter and the letter to Philemon, and Paul's just not mentioning this, or this is the relationship that has been previously restored, and now Onesimus is a part of the church family. People still remember the past conflicts that have taken place. Paul is using, and I think Onesimus is modeling, and so is Philemon in that way, or will model, depending on when it's written, what it looks like to have this healing, unifying moment as people who have been in the midst of conflict and disagreement in faith. So, as we'll see as we look at Philemon next week, there's been some sort of breach in the relationship, but it is Christ who gives them a way to move forward in faith and together in relationship that the culture at large in the time that they lived simply would not have allowed for. And so I think that's an important image as we close this letter out to kind of hold on to and remember. What Christ does is provide us a way forward that is not like the world that is around us. So often I think we fit Christianity inside a culture that is comfortable to us. We take what we like and how we think the world should be, and we fit Christianity inside of that. It becomes a piece of our world, certainly not the whole. And what Paul is trying to get them to understand is that Christianity, that Christ is the whole, that it is the thing that defines and inspires their lives, their actions as people of faith in the world, and that it should be what has final say on how they interact towards each other, and how they interact towards the community at large. Of course, that is being challenged in the church in Colossae, though Paul doesn't mention it in this spot directly, by people who are saying, oh, no, it's this, oh, no, it's that, or you take this, or you need that. For Paul, it starts and ends with Christ. If they know who Christ is, and if they model their life on Christ, and if they interact with each other in the way that Jesus interacted with those who were around him, and if they are willing to forgive, being especially important in the case of Onesimus and Philemon, but certainly also in the case of those who have been false teachers leading people astray in the church in Colossae, then they need to find ways to heal those divides, to bridge those gaps that have come up in those relationships. And the only way that they are going to be able to do that is through Jesus. Now, I think there's a temptation on our end to view that stuff as platitude. Like, oh, yeah, that sounds nice. But when it comes down to it, we're not really willing to do the type of work that it takes to heal those relationships. Or the other temptation on our end is to assume that we have no responsibility in the broken relationship, and therefore we should not have to worry too much about it. When they come to me and apologize, then I can forgive them and we'll move on. Neither of those, I think, are acceptable ways to do things, and Paul doesn't let that be the path forward for them. I find it incredibly interesting that for all of the disagreement, especially over wrong teaching that exists as far as what Paul is addressing in this letter, Paul does not spend a significant amount of time discussing how to kick heretics out of the church. Instead, Paul is very interested in how you heal those relationships and move forward in faith. And that's a good reminder for us as well. I think we fall into that's too broad a statement. Let me rephrase that. I think there's a temptation in churches, one that I have witnessed in some churches, though not ones that I've been in personally, of operating under a mentality that says if they do not think exactly how I do about the things that I find most important, then there's no room for them here and they need to simply move on down the road. That's the easy way. The easy way is to simply break relationships with people who think and function different than you do. But that is so rarely the option the Bible presents us with. And in the few cases where that is the option that is presented, we're talking about things that are so extreme and people so unwilling to heal relationships and move back together that it is simply the only option other than lighting a match and walking away. Instead, Paul reminds all of them that they have a responsibility towards each other, and that how they live towards each other matters, and that how they live towards each other must be shaped by how Christ lived for them. One of the things that kicks off the letter, maybe the most important set of verses in the letter, 1:15 through 20, gives us an image of a Jesus who was willing to love and to sacrifice in spite of the fact that he was so much greater, so much more powerful, so supreme over, and yet didn't lord it over. And I think that becomes an important image to focus on as the letter winds down. It's not about who has power in the relationship. It's not who can bend the other to their will. It's not who has the most convincing arguments. It's who lives most like Jesus. That's the model that we're going for. And so I think that, though it isn't stated, in such a direct way at the end of the letter, is the idea the letter wants to end on whenever he talks about what it looks like to act wisely towards outsiders, to make the most of opportunities, to be gracious towards each other, and to have your prayer shaped by thanksgiving, and also to pray for them as well. It's this idea that the life of Jesus shapes how you live towards and on behalf of those who are around you, certainly Paul and the others included. The last thing that I'll point out, which doesn't necessarily shape the meaning of the letter of Colossae in any significant way, but is interesting as we think about how ancient writing worked, is that verse 16 says this: after this letter has been read to you publicly, make sure that the church in Laodicea reads it and that you read the one from Laodicea. And there's just this recognition that even though this letter is kind of specific to the church in Colossae, it still has meaning outside those walls. And it also tells us that maybe Laodicea is battling some of the exact same issues that the church in Colossae is. We may never see the letter to Laodicea. We may already have it and call it something different. I talked about that early on, maybe the first week that we did this. But just this recognition that the church community was sharing in each other's lives. Laodicea and Colossae are not, 2 feet away from each other. There's some miles between the town. It takes some time to get the letter back and forth, and yet there's still very much a community that's being shaped by the same message and living for the same Christ. And I think that's important for us to remember also as we think about living life alongside our Christian neighbors here where we are, whether they are, exactly like us, which is basically none of them, or whether they are, have some different ideas, they're in a different location, they have some different experiences. There are all sorts of things we can disagree on. The thing that must unite us and move the message, the gospel forward, is the gospel, is Jesus. And maybe that's where we should wrap up this evening. Thank you for taking the time to watch these videos. Again, next week, I think we're going to look at the letter to Philemon because it does connect to the writing to the church in Colossae, and I think kind of helps round out that message on a very practical level, what it looks like for two people who have been on opposite ends of some sort of relationship break, to forgive and to move forward with the same purpose, one of sharing and teaching the gospel. So glad that you were able to join us, and I will see you again next week.